Hi, everyone, and welcome to our monthly presentation for the 5-Star Homebrew Club program. I'm Erin Hamrick, the marketing manager here at 5-Star, and we're really excited to have Mike Brennan and Kevin Sullivan joining us today to talk about Firkin with fruit. And so just a couple of housekeeping things to remind you of. If you want to say hello in the chat, say where you're listening in from, that would be great. If you do have a question, please use the Ask a Question prompt at the bottom of the screen. That way others can review the question, vote it up to the top, and then Mike and Kevin can also review that. I know that Mike wants to keep it a dialogue here, so if you have any question at any time, he wants to get that conversation going during the presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to them.
Hey everybody, how are we? Can you hear us, Aaron? To me that's a yes. Excellent. Hi everybody. It's nice to see you all. Thanks for joining us. As Aaron said, my name is Mike Brennan. I'm the National Sales Director for BSG Handcraft. Kevin Sullivan sitting next to me is our inside sales coordinator. Both of us are longtime fermentation fanatics. We'll talk a little bit about that background and kind of dig right into this. This talk is being developed for HomebrewCon, so I've got a few things that I'll kind of come back and forth on. There might be some repeats and things like that. And the reminder to all of you is it's a conversation. So I'm hoping that you all have some questions. Drop it into the question box. I'll try to stop every now and then, take a look at it, and we'll continue right through it. First off, thank you to 5-Star Chemicals for hosting us, for Rockstars Aaron Hamrick and Emily Lotto for inviting us to talk a bit with you about fermenting with fruit. Today's conversation is several topics related to using fruit in your fermentation. That's whether you're making a fruit beer, a fruited mead, which if you don't know is also more formally called a melomel, unless of course you're using wine grapes, and then it's called a pyment. Cider with other fruit added, or fruit wine. The primary goal is attaining balance in your final beverage. And again, I'm going to repeat myself. This is a HomebrewCon lecture in development. I'll be giving it next month at HomebrewCon. There might be some incomplete information, maybe repeat. Please remember, it is a conversation with you, and I want to get into that. So I'm going to try to keep an eye on that question box through here. Throw your questions in. If I miss your question, we'll circle back to them. I've got about an hour and 15 minutes with you, so we should be able to get through most of this. I've been a mad fermentationist for about 26 years now. And again, I'm leading part of that homebrew footprint these past few years as the BSG sales director. I'm pretty passionate about all things fermented. My undergraduate work was in cell and molecular biology, minor in chemistry. I'm always fascinated by processes and outcomes. I've also been a BJCP judge since 2014. I'm a national with mead and cider endorsements. So all this translates to the most important part of beverage making, which is to make something delicious. It has to attain balance. Kevin is, as I said, is our inside sales coordinator. He's been fermenting for 15 years. He's managed homebrew shops up here in the Pacific Northwest. He worked with me at Pico Brew in the past, where he developed the customer service system we had there. If you're at HomebrewCon this year, we'll have a bunch of beer there, and Kevin actually is fermenting most of that out for us. So good times.
I got 55 gallons currently fermenting in my kitchen.
Oh, that just sounds absolutely lovely. So I can't wait till all this is done. One of those questions I want you to ask yourself when we're talking about doing a fruit beer, like any beverage, the first thing I want you to stop and remember: did you choose the right beverage? Did you write or did you discover a good recipe? Did you select quality ingredients? Did you clean and sanitize your equipment and your fermenters?
Which product would we recommend for that?
Well, we're with 5-Star, but I'm going to go back and say that again. Did you clean and sanitize your equipment and your fermenters? We can talk all we want ad nauseum about water chemistry, about ingredient quality. If you don't start off with things cleaned up and sanitized properly, you're going to end up having a problem. That's going to wreck your beverage far worse than choosing the wrong malt or making the wrong size additions of anything like that. I have been judging for since 2014, so 8 years. I've judged beer, mead, and cider entries, which have had a laundry list of added flavors. Did my best to pick through the aromas and the flavors of those beverages to find those additions. And by the way, if you enter competition and you list those ingredients, you're judged on their presence. If you have 6 things listed, we expect to find those 6 things in there. Ultimately, though, what we're going to determine is, number one, did you make a good beverage? And your friends are going to do the same thing when they try your beer. Number two, are your flavors in balance? Number three, important to drinkability, did it work? Did what you chose to do actually do what you wanted it to do? So just a kind of background, if we want to go back to like history on these things. If we go all the way back, I mean, mead arguably is the first fermented beverage, or at least when we kind of, there's a hypothesis of accidental fermentation of, honey caught and, tree stumps, getting water in them, people getting in there and going, wow, this is really fun. We know overripe fruit can ferment, which, hence plenty of YouTube videos of drunk animals eating fruit. We know that wine, the actual fermentation of grapes goes back at least 6,000 BC. We can find evidence of that in the Mediterranean region of Georgia, not the Atlanta one. We can find evidence in Iran back to 5,000 BC, etc. Anyways, we know that this goes back a long time. And the first time fruit, we don't know, but, there's references in Egypt of using pomegranates and dates. There's other dabblings of fruit and beer, but we don't really see commercial beers being produced until, of course, my favorite people, the Belgians. Surprisingly, these aren't really ancient beers, but they're more 20th century creations. Those classic Belgians of fruit styles, Kriek, which is a cherry beer, Framboise, the raspberry beer. These really didn't start appearing as in commercial beers till 1930s. And that's when you start seeing those. We see some older ones of lambics and stuff, but those fruited beers come later. I think Framboise pops up in the 1950s, and the Pesches, the peach beers, that's a 1980s creation. They really not go back as far as some of us thought they did. I've always thought, I am sure that there are some Belgian farmers out there.
That's the thing that you kind of realize with the Belgians as you read into a lot of their histories. Really, they just kind of fermented with whatever they had on hand.
Yeah, they're great rebels. They're like the anti-Rhine.
Just throw it in; it'll be fine.
Exactly. Those those lambic beers I mentioned are not a fruit beer, but they're a wheat beer. Tend to be a wheat base with a really complex, open fermentation, meaning a lot of bugs get in and out of there. It's pretty interesting. Let's fast forward to some of the kind of reinterpretations and things that led into some fun, crazy stuff like Dog Vached's Midas Touch, which was early 2000s.
That would have been around 2007, 2008. That was the third homebrew recipe I ever did, and I think to date it's probably one of the more expensive because you had stuff like honey and saffron in there, and it was good. It was definitely good. I'll give it that.
It's not a cheap beer to make.
No, it is not.
But yeah, it was honey, muscat grapes. I don't know if you know the story behind this, but Sam Calagione got together with a molecular anthropologist who discovered molecular leftovers on the inside of drinking vessels from the tomb of King Midas. That's where all this got figured out. So it's somewhere between a beer, a wine, and a mead. Kind of crazy. So, but again, modern interpretation of that. There are some post-ferment blend ideas. Like for a while, it was popular with the German Radler style. So Radler simply means cyclist in German. Basically taking a light beer, basically a pilsner, some sort, and adding it to lemonade or a citrusy beverage. Cuts it down to 2 to 3% low alcohol. Good hot day quaffer and not crash your bike after you drink. Some of the most current ones that we're seeing that have popped up, if you're a BJCP person, you've seen these Catarina sours. They're popping in from Brazil. It's a style that was developed there. Think about a Berliner Weiss style beer with local fruits added. There's a lot of fruits that grow in Brazil that don't get brought to the United States because they're delicate. They don't have a long shelf life there, and so it was used in these ferments. It's become popular, and it's kind of taken off. So that lactose sourness, fresh fruit is in there, light and refreshing, really highly carbonated. We mentioned earlier about fruited meads, melomels, or wine grape meads, meaning pyments. Those have been around a long time. And again, I'm not going to go into specific conditions for each of these fermentations, but we want you to get familiar with what those conditions are so you can dig into more sources that are out there for details. We don't want to be your source people. We've got a lot of information to talk about. I'm going to pop up a question here. Somebody popped a question in. So Belgians didn't start adding fruit to their sours till the 20th century. Was that farmers or monks? Probably not monks.
Well, yeah, that's we pointed out that was more the commercial examples.
Yeah.
I mean, historically, I think the Belgians just kind of brewed with whatever they had on hand.
Yeah, I think they're pretty resourceful people in terms of that. But Tara, good question. Thanks for asking. Let's move forward here. So let's start off by talking about selecting the right beverage for the fruit that you want to use. One of the challenges of fruiting a beer are hops. Hops can obviously, they bring, remember in the hot side, they're going to bring a lot of bitterness to the beer. They can. And bitterness can clash with fruit because we commonly associate bitter fruit with unripeness. So there's some sort of negative association if we crash those into each other. Additionally, fruit is going to contribute to acidity. So that's, if we're talking, sciencey, it's a lower pH number. All fruits have some level of acid. Some fruits have really high levels of acid, like limes or something like that, but they're all going to do that. Also, if you've ever looked at what happens in fermentation, the pH of a ferment naturally the fermentation process naturally decreases the pH of a beverage. So what do we normally mash at?
5.2 is, the target. Usually 5.1 to 5.3 is that range.
So if we're starting off in the low fives, when we're done with the ferment, we usually tend to kind of end up in the mid fours somewhere for a standard non-soured ferment. So what's going to happen when you add fruit? You're going to be adding acids. Those fruits, like I mentioned, like lemons and limes are acidic. Something like blueberries might not contribute as much, but you're still going to drive the pH of your ferment down. So make sure your yeast can tolerate that. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this too. Attenuation. Is your yeast going to survive the ferment long enough to attenuate? But not only that, but we don't want to over attenuate. What happens when we over attenuate?
Right. Yeah. You don't want it to end up being so dry that it's not complementing the flavors and the fruits that are behind, and like you don't want something that's like super thin in body either. You want a little bit of that residual mouthfeel there as well that the sugars will give you.
Yeah. If we lose that, your fruit's not going to pop, and you're going to lose it. So bone dry things with fruit in them tend to sometimes lack character. That's always a challenge. I mentioned up here one of the other things that fruits can bring, especially from the skins, the pits and seeds, are tannins. So first off, what's a tannin? Tannin is just this really big molecule. It's found in things like oak, obviously, because wine barrels and things like that. Black tea, green tea, but it's also it's in many parts of fruit: skins, pits, seeds, especially things like strawberries, pomegranates, and most of the berries that we talk about, like blueberries and cranberries. What do tannins do? I don't want to go off too much in the chemistry, but they bind onto proteins and then they actually fall out of solution and precipitate, especially in our mouths. So here's your pro tip. If you're not sure if what you're tasting is the bitterness is a tannin or something else, little tasting tip: take a sip of your beverage, rub your tongue on the front, up and down in front of your lower teeth. So that kind of thing. If it feels gritty, you can feel that little almost gritty rubbing feeling. That's actually tannins. Those tannins are attaching to protein components in your saliva, and they're coming out of solution. And by the way, that's why tannins are considered, they're a mouthfeel. They're not a flavor, because we actually don't taste tannins with our taste buds of our tongue. We actually, it's the sense of touch in our mouths that's actually picking up tannins. So little side note on those, but important, because we're going to talk here in a few minutes about balance, and tannins are really important to that. What's going to happen in a beer if we're doing, beer versus mead versus cider versus wine? In beer, tannins can clash with any kind of astringency, like from grain huskiness. So be careful of over-sparging. I don't want to go off in brewing techniques. If you're not sure, look up what over-sparging means. Make sure you're not doing it if you do all grain brewing. Tannins can also increase the perceived hop bitterness of a beer. So one of our important things when we're doing these fruit beers, think about how will you turn down those hop additions. when you brew with fruit beers, do you kind of have a rule of thumb that you use, or how do you think about it in general?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what I'm making, but usually I'll turn down, my IBUs, my bittering hops. Like I try to have the fruit either be the focus or at least, complement everything else there, not be. You don't want other ingredients overbearing the fruit unless you're trying to combine flavors.
Excellent, excellent. So, yeah, that beer that you thought you wanted to have pop, like even an IPA, if you're going for that stuff, maybe knock that bittering addition down, depending on the fruit you're using. If you're using a very tannic and strong fruit, bump it down 75% even.
Yeah, something with a lot of pith, like citrus fruits. Yeah.
Yeah. Think about how they're going to complement each other and not crash into each other. That's important. And of course, sweetness, we talked about that earlier. We do want those perceptions of sweetness because it's going to support it's going to support those other flavors in there. We threw a few styles together. These are just suggestions as a starting point for a fruited beer. This is by no means any kind of a guide because many styles can be adapted. So think it through. Is this really going to work? We mentioned like IPA, like sea hop beers, so Cascade, Centennial, Columbus, Amarillo, those types of things. Think of like grapefruit sculpin was a really great example. It is a great example of a good, fruited IPA. They did a nice job making those flavors come into balance and work. Playing around with those tropical fruits, well, pair them up with a New World hop or any of those experimental hops that you find out there. There's a mention up here on the slide that you'll see the word thiols. We'll talk here a little bit later. I'm going to talk for a moment about thiols. It's obviously a hot topic these days. Yeah. We'll get into that in here a little bit, and I'll talk more about that. Stouts, really nice choice because getting those bigger those red fruits in there. So
yeah, I mean, you think about the flavors you normally get from a stout. You get a lot of coffee and chocolate and those darker flavors, and just think about what pairs well with those. So you tend to get a lot of like the red fruits and red berries with those, stuff like cherries and strawberries, and like sometimes you can throw something like orange, like citrus, or like we get the chocolate covered mango bits here. Yeah. And so like sometimes it'll work, but sometimes it'll just kind of clash. Just kind of think about what pairs well together, just because you're kind of throwing everything together into a pot, just hoping that it turns out.
Yeah, we want to do more than that. Yeah. That's a good example. Go down the candy aisle and see what's working for fine chocolate that day. That's probably going to do pretty well. One of our best suggestions, Kevin's favorite suggestions, are wheat beers because they're neutral canvas.
Yeah, neutral, and then I mean, they're very simple, but they're also pretty diverse. Where like you could, they're very easy to sour. You can do something like a Berliner Weiss, which always pairs really well with fruits. You can just do like classic American wheat ale. You could do like classic German Hefeweizen, which I mean, not traditionally you wouldn't serve it with a lemon, but over here we got the the lemon thing going. And
heresy.
Yeah, but it works. It pairs really well. Plus you get all those fruity esters from the yeast that you tend to use in a lot of those wheat beers that blend really well with a lot of those flavors.
Very cool. So good examples there, and yeah, Kevin mentioned like especially those esters coming from those yeast that we use with wheat beers. This works out really well. So if this is new to you, if you're just trying fruit, it's a really great place. And wheat beer recipes are really.
I mean, there's not many fruits I think that wouldn't work well in a wheat beer. It's kind of the monkey wrench or like crescent wrench for beers and fruit.
I like that. Now let's flip the conversation over from the fruit to let's look at the right beverage. Look, I guess continuing on that, I'm sorry, the theme continues, because I want to talk for a few minutes about wine, cider, and mead, since obviously we're in a different beverage. This is that classic trio of balance among the sensory experiences that we want to find in these beverages. And that's that balance between acids, tannins, and the sweet component. I'm going to talk a couple minutes on this. So first of all, and again, I'm just going to breeze over these, and I suggest you do spend a little time learning about. There's three primary acids that we find in the fruits that we use in fermentation. So malic acid, that's the acid we find in apples, predominantly. Citric acid, obviously by its name, is the acid predominantly found in citrus fruit. And tartaric acid, even though it's got an odd name, is the acid the majority of the acid in wine grapes. Now, however, wine grapes contain all three of those. Other fruits contain them as well. And there are many, many other acids in smaller quantities. There's a lot of them out there. These are the ones I want you to remember, those three: malic, citric, tartaric. Learn about those and see what their effects are, because each one of them can be perceived as stronger or weaker. And they also have some chemistry things that I won't go into too much about why they're perceived that way. A side note for a second, for winemakers or those of you who drink wine and you've heard of malolactic fermentation. So it's a bacteria that converts malic acid into lactic acid. The bacteria chews up the malic acid, actually uses a part of it. It comes out as lactic. It's a little less, it does less contributory stuff in solution. Again, I don't want to go too much chemistry, but it's a softer acid, so we perceive it as decreasing the acid, so we can actually
tends to be less harsh than the malic.
There you go. That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
So MLF is popular, but can be challenges with it.
And side note, when you go into your homebrew shop and you see, the packages of acid blend, that's usually an equal blend of malic, tartaric, and citric acid.
That's a good call up. Those other acids I mentioned one other one, which was lactic acid. If you've looked at, sour beer, like lactose souring, kettle souring, these are that lactic acid production has to be done in the absence of oxygen. This is a really good test when you're investigating like the flavor of a beverage and you're not sure what's going on, like in your ferment. Lactic acid bacteria and lactic acid producers can only do it in the absence of oxygen. If you get acetic acid, so that's the acid of vinegar, those vinegary notes, that means you have acetobacter or something. But no matter what, acetic acid will only be produced in the presence of oxygen. So it's that's kind of a, when you're being the beer detective or the beverage detective, when you're judging a beer or you're trying to figure it out yourself for your home ferment, make sure that you're noting. It's like, if I'm getting acetic vinegary notes, you have an oxygen.
Yeah, it's an aerobic fermentation versus anaerobic.
There you go. So if we look at like acids for wines, the typical pH level for a white wine is somewhere in the low 3s. For reds, low to mid 3s. Mead and cider can be in those ranges as well. But remember, you are working down in a much more acidic beverage than a beer is. So if you ever, if you're drinking some beer and then you go to cider, sometimes you get the pucker factor the first time you get that one in there. It's just because you're used to, your mouth has become accustomed to that mid-4s pH of a beer, right? We talked about tannins a bit, so I won't go back to those, but sweetness. Sweetness has actually 3 factors to it. The sugars that might be left over in your ferment, if you ferment it all the way to dryness, they won't be there. But if we leave a little residual, especially with those, if you're trying to make fruit pop, you probably want to leave a little bit. Second is the sweetness from the fruitiness itself. So fruity esters tend to be perceived as sweet. And then the third one is alcohol. Because alcohol tastes sweet to us. So when we say the word sweetness, you can have a bone dry beverage with no actual measurable residual sugars, but you can still have the sweetness from the fruitiness and the alcohol. You'll find that example in certain red wines. One of my favorite from the Piedmont region of Italy are dolcettos. Dolcettos are one of my favorite wines. They're bone dry. There's no residual sugar, but they have a huge amount of fruitiness from all the fruity esters and such that are in there. And so there's that perception, and then that's supported and carried by the alcohol sweetness in there. And Dawn, I see a question up here about pineapple flavor. We're going to roll down here in about a half hour. We'll be at that part of this where we're going to talk a little bit more about those fruits. So hang tight, and we're going to talk about some of those fruits. And I'm also going to actually call out pineapple specifically. It's a very interesting and challenging fruit to ferment with. So as we're selecting the right fruit, there's some basics. This is not a botany lesson, but you should be familiar enough with your choice of fruits to know what you're using. First and foremost, what is a fruit? A fruit is the part of a plant any plant that has flowers and makes seeds that's the part of the flowering plant. Some plants, don't really produce anything. Other plants produce something large. So a cucumber, tomatoes, bananas, kiwis, persimmons, grapes. These are all, even avocado, avocados and eggplants are fruits. They're what's called a primary fruit. There's one fruit for every flower. berries like blackberries and raspberries are actually called aggregate fruits. Actually, each one of those, when you look at a blackberry, raspberry, there's like a bunch of little tiny nodules around it. It's because each one of those comes from different parts of the same flower. Other ones like Don just brought up, pineapple. Pineapple comes from multiple flowers all together. It's a multiple fruit. Other things like apples are important because they're an accessory fruit that's not actually made from. It's not from the actual flower's ovary. It's an accessory to that. And then the last one I'll mention because they're kind of fascinating in a lot of ways, and another challenging fruit to work with are strawberries. First of all, it's not even a berry. Again, not being too botany, but it's an accessory aggregate fruit. What the actual berry, the part that we eat, the part we want, the red flesh, is actually a stem. That's actually a specialized enlarged part of the stem. It's holding on to a bunch of fruit, which are all the little dots on the outside. So that's that word up there, the achenes. So what we call strawberry seeds are not actually, well, what you see is not a seed. It's actually a little tiny fruit called an achene. Get under a microscope and break it open. There's actually a seed inside all of those little dotted things on the outside. But all those achenes, they contribute a lot of tannins to the beverage. There's also a lot of odd things. If we have time at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about the oddness of strawberry and why sometimes it's hard to get a clean strawberry ferment without getting a little bit like barfy. And there's a reason for that as well. So what's inside of all this stuff? What are we after? We're after sugars. Oops, sorry about that. There we go. We're after sugars, and we're after acids, we're after flavors. The sugars we're after, the primary sugars we're after, are the two simplest ones, which are single. They're single molecules. Again, I don't want to do too much chemistry, but you should know a few of them. Glucose, it's kind of the universal energy currency of all living things. So glucose is in them. You might also see the term as dextrose. It has to do with just a different shape. It's the same molecule. Fructose, it's where it gets its name from. It's commonly found in fruit sugars. One more we don't care about called galactose that animals make. We're not going to worry about that today. There's also a few common 2-unit sugars, things that are bonded, and that's important because yeast have to figure those bonds out. So sucrose, what you know as white table sugar, is actually one of those glucoses and a fructose that are bonded together. Most yeast can figure it out and break that bond. They tend to have the enzyme for it that can break that bond. Maltose, it's 2 glucoses stuck together in a way that's easily broken apart. Clearly, its name comes from malted barley. So that what we find a lot of in malted barley. The last one, we're just going to we do want to know it, but it's non-fermentable, which is lactose. It has to do with another simple sugar, galactose, bounded with a glucose. We don't care about that. What we do care about is that only mammals produce lactose, and only mammals have enzymes that can break it apart. Yeast can't do it. This is why lactose is a non-fermentable sugar. So milk stouts, cream stouts, we'll use that lactose addition because yeast can't break those things and they don't have the enzymes. They can't figure it out. So, but what's important to that, along with some other like little bit longer sugars, big ugly word called oligosaccharides, sugars anywhere from 3 to 10 sugars long. Most yeast can't break them down. All that stays behind. So lactose, if it's there, of course, the fruit, it's not there. But those longer sugars, those stay behind. They're going to contribute to body. So the body component of mouthfeel, what we're picking up as body of something, a large component of that are those sugars that didn't get broken down. There's a million other things we could talk about with sugars and starches. We're not going to do that. We're after those things. We already talked about acids. We do know that those acids are going to, that the fruit's going to contribute that. Sugar acid relationship. Unripe fruit tends to contribute more acid. More ripened fruit's going to contribute more sugar and less acid. So as we get into talking about what fruits that we're after, I'll mention, what we'll call edible ripeness versus true fully ripened fruit. We like fruit with some crunch to it, some body. That means we still have some starches that haven't converted all the way to sugars. We want the fruit really soft, probably more soft than you like to eat. What we sometimes call overripe, but we don't want bruised and oxidized, right? Because we don't want the yuck. But we do want that fruit really soft because that means it's going to contribute the most sugar, the most flavor, and the moderate amount of acidity that we can manage in our ferment. the flavors that come out, I didn't make a slide for it because it's just really messy. If you look at like a lot of esters that things produce, you get really insanely busy charts like this that are covered in fruits. It simply means that there's a lot of fruity esters that are produced in a fruit when fruit matures. Those esters are the components of that. It's also what makes up other anything that's fruity tends to be that. There are phenolic compounds in things like vanilla, spicy things, pepper, and things like that. Those are phenolics. And then there's that last category I'm just going to talk for a minute on. That's thiols. So if you've heard me lecture before, I do a lecture on hop terpenes and thiols. Thiols are simply sulfur-containing molecules. For whatever reason, humans are incredibly highly sensitized to thiols. We detect many thiols actually in the parts per trillion range. I know it's a really, really hard number to think about how small that actually is. So think about one drop of water in 18. 18 yeah. So it's incredibly small, but we can detect it. And you have too, if you've ever opened up the skunked beer, that skunk, that broken hop molecule, 12 to 18 parts per trillion, you can pick it up. What's it relevant to here? Stone fruits. All those stone fruit things that you get from a really nice fully ripened peach, nectarine, things like that.
Passion fruit, papaya.
There you go. Yeah,
so a lot of the tropical fruit. Well, most of the tropical fruits, mango.
Yeah, so it's really important to understand that that's where those flavors come from. We could do a whole nother 2 hours on what's going on right now in the world of thiols. They've been hard to discuss until the last several years because the techniques to actually isolate them and name them has been pretty challenging up to this point. But about 7-8 years ago, people started doing some really nice stuff at University of Nottingham, doing a bunch of chemistry we won't talk about today. But suffice to say that it's important that you're understanding thiols and releasing thiols. If you're a Sauvignon Blanc winemaker, you probably actually are a little more familiar with it because that's all the nose and gooseberry and all those things coming up on stone fruit.
Especially the New Zealand ones. There's like that terroir from the New Zealand ones where just the thiols just tend to pop.
And that's a really important thing. So yeah, thiols, they are so hot right now, as you can see by our guy up there. That's a lychee fruit, by the way, up in the top right corner of the slide. If you've never seen lychee, it's been kind of my current interesting fruit. I want to get a hold of a bunch of fresh stuff and try some ferments with it. So what fruit format? Number one priority before we even, there's a lot of ways you can get your fruit. You can get it fresh, you can get it frozen, you can get a puree, canned fruit or processed fruit. You can even just use juice. Pros and cons, we'll talk about it for a minute. Number one, before you worry, did you taste it? If you didn't taste the fruit before you tried it, don't put it in your beer because if you don't like it, your yeast just might not like it either and might not do what you want. Fresh fruit, is it fully ripe? Great litmus test when you're walking around the store and you walk by the peaches. Mm-hmm. If you can't smell the peaches, they are not vine ripe. They were picked green. They were gas ripened. They used ethylene gas. And it's not ripe. And so if you smelling like, and I know you've all experienced this, you go to your local grocery store, you pick up the fruit, you smell it, and it's not going to have a lot of pop. And when you ferment it, there's not going to be much left in there. You're going to have a really kind of dead thing. Farmers markets, what do you like to hit for fruit?
I tend to go for the nice fresh apples, and I enjoy a good peach.
Yeah, so farmers markets are a great place to start. Knowing that they're grown organically, you are putting a lot in there and you are concentrating it. So I like to tend to work with organic fruits. If there are pesticide residues on fruit and you're using a lot of it and you're concentrating it down, I think about that in terms of what's going to be in your final beverage. You do need to clean it and prep it. We're going to talk about prepping here in a few minutes. Frozen fruit. What's the best part of it? It's handy. It's ready to go. But you do need to check its flavor and your quality. Defrost some of it. Make sure you taste it. Get into it and see what you think. It's already been frozen once. My favorite way, and you'll see in another slide here, I'll talk about my favorite way of getting fruit ready is to freeze it and defrost it twice. The reason being is that, as you know, like when you make ice cubes, when you freeze water molecules expand. When you take full ripened fruit and you freeze it, it expands and it breaks the cell walls. It actually breaks the fruit apart. So if you've ever frozen and defrosted fruit a couple times, it turns to mush in the bag, which makes it really accessible to ferment with. You do the, freeze it, defrost twice. We'll talk about it in a few minutes, and sanitize your bag, cut it off, and squirt it into your ferment. You've got a really clean way to add fruit. Purees. So finding like aseptic purees that are out on the market. We actually have a new one. I'm going to do a shameless plug here in a few minutes on some information where you can find some good information about fermenting with fruit. But those those purees, whether they're frozen or they're shelf stable, they're real handy. Make sure you're looking for the ones that have been single step ultra high temperature pasteurization. They go through one very brief high temp process and they're done. It means that you're going to preserve the fresh fruit flavor and they're not going to have that cooked flavor. And that brings me to canned fruit. And that's the challenge of canned fruit, or those processed fruits. They're handy, but they've been cooked twice. In the industry, it's called a double retort process. And actually, if you're a home canner, that's actually what you're doing. You're gonna cook your stuff. You're gonna put it in the can. You're gonna seal it, so when it cools, it creates the vacuum. And then you're gonna go put it in a pressure cooker and you're gonna cook it for a while. So canned fruit is cooked fruit. So even if it's in it's in its own juices and things like that, you've got cooked fruit that you're working with. So it's not my first recommendation. I'm not a big fan of using cooked fruit if you can avoid it. Juice is really handy because what if you're like a labor-intensive fruit or something that has a lot of like pomegranates, all the little achenes in there are going to be a bear.
Yeah, pomegranate's a pain in the butt to handle. Like I do a little bit with some of the beverages that I do. I buy the pomegranate juice. I don't buy the brand that everyone knows with the 3 letters. I tend to go more towards the natural glass ones. That sometimes they tend to be from concentrate, but like they're pomegranate and their cranberry, like they add the flavor that you're looking for. There's no added sugar. They're very easy to work with.
Yeah. And the only one thing you want to call out though
is look for the preservatives, especially if you're doing something like cider. Potassium sorbate, sodium benzoate, they're yeast inhibitors. We're going to talk a little bit more about those later, but just make sure that what you're buying, it's either like flash pasteurized or fresh, but we'll talk about how you want to process that later if it's fresh.
Cool. And again, just that big call. Look at the label. Look for preservatives. Really, really important. Cleaning your fruit up, especially for that fresh fruit, if you're playing with it, is a thorough wash in the sink is usually good enough. How do you use anything when you wash fruit?
I'll usually do a very light solution of unscented dish soap and just kind of let it soak for a little bit, give it a good scrub, and rinse everything off really well.
Store-bought fruits, by the way, like apples and stuff, like they look so pretty. They also have that little coat of wax on there.
Yeah.
So detergent will proper, like Kevin said, an unscented one, it'll take that wax off of there as well. A good way to prep that up as well. There are on almost all fruits, there's wild yeast that are hanging out on it. In fact, in the questions, I answered by hand, but if you guys go look in the questions for homebrewer Bob, he was talking about making wild ferment. He's foraging the fruits of prickly pear. They're called tunas. And though he was talking about just fermenting those and leaving them wild and go for the wild ferment. That's a fun one. I answered him and I let him know, he's like, they're wild, so they're exactly that. They're unpredictable. I tend to go for cooler season wild ferments. The yeasts that are robust during warm seasons tend to be a little more challenging. Sometimes they produce some metallic flavors, things like that. But if you do a full domesticated yeast pitch, you can usually outcompete those yeast. And Anshu, you have a question about how much fruit in which form should be added, any general calculation. I'm actually going to be coming up here on a slide, and I've actually got a good source for that. It's a website. There's 2 websites actually I'm going to refer to here in a few minutes for you guys to find a lot of information. Up to recently, I've never really found a good fruit addition chart, and there's one that Brett Baker at Urban Artifact Brewery has come out with, along with a fruit puree company. So they're pretty cool. But that thorough wash is usually good enough. That lactic acid bacteria.
Yeah, you're going to find it on a lot of vegetables. it's like making sauerkraut, like the, not that you'd ever use cabbage in beer.
Please don't do cabbage.
Yeah, I would hope not. Shit, we might have just actually created a new style.
No.
So yeah, I mean, you're going to have that lactic bacteria in the cabbage. Same thing on, I forget who it was. I think his name was Bright. He was at the Yakima Chief Hop and Brew School. He did a really good talk on brewing with peppers. But one of the things he brought up was using that you had lactic acid or like lactic bacteria on the pepper stems. Normally, like while you were processing those, you'd want to remove that,
get rid of the stems,
just to get that
because
out
it
of
concentrates.
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting. Yeah, and so the cutting off those stems, things like that. If you're making a wine or a cider or a mead, you can remember you're using sulfites as well. You can sulfite. We'll talk about sulfite here in a minute. Obviously, as a beer maker, you don't have the option of using sulfites in your beer. Beer and sulfites don't mix. So.
Yeah, I mean there was a study a while ago where, because of its antioxidant properties, it works pretty well as at preventing beer from oxidizing. But I to this day I've never added sulfites to my beer, and I'd never want to.
Yeah, we're not going to go there too much though. So let's go back to those that fruit. If you choose to puree and pasteurize, if you want to do that, we're going to talk for a minute about that pasteurization process if you want to do it at home. Notice the temperature range we put up here. So 150 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes, and that's it. The problem is and also Kevin has suggested, also a lot of sources do, which is use a double boiler. That way you have far better control over the heat. It's gentler, and you're not going to cook anything.
You're not going to scorch those sugars in there.
Yeah, because what's going to happen, we're going to talk about pectin in another slide here in a minute. But again, remember, a lot of fruits contain pectins. We'll talk about that. It's a big sugar molecule. If we activate that pectin, we get that a little bit hotter. You're making jelly. So we don't want to make jelly. I am not a fan, and I'm going to talk about jelly beers. We're not going to do
There's that cranberry jelly one.
No, it does not exist.
Sorry.
Yeah, it does not exist. So we're just going to pretend it doesn't. So another thing, don't add the fruit to the hot side of the kettle. Better to finish off, put that in on cold side after you've cleaned it up and maybe pasteurized it. So on to that question. So here, a shameless plug here. This is a small excerpt from Boiron Fruit Purees. It's called Les Vergères Boiron. They're a French company. We now bring in, so BSG, we bring in their fruit purees now in a line called Ambient. It's been ultra high temperature pasteurized, and it's shelf stable. This is an excerpt from his chart that he developed. He is the CEO and brewmaster of Artifact I mentioned earlier. He uses about 1 million pounds of fruit annually in his beers there. He produces our fruit tart ales. They're pretty amazing things. This chart is, like I said, he goes through, on the chart has over 50 different fruits. He has dosages, recommended beer styles, descriptions, a lot of information. I don't have a link to put up here because it's kind of long, but if you go look online or go to the, I think we have it on our BSG website. We may not quite have that yet, but it will pop up there pretty soon. And I recommend that you go take a look at it. It's just a great chart. Notice it's in pounds per barrel. If you're coming to HomebrewCon, you can actually meet Brett. He's going to be with us at the BSG booth, along with some of the other Boiron US crew. He's their beer ambassador. You can taste some of the purees, and you can chat with Brett. He's obviously a compendium of knowledge of working with fruit beers as well, because this is what the guys, beers are amazing. When I present the stock at HomebrewCon, I'll probably have some of these more popular fruits from his dosing chart converted into pounds per gallon. For those of you who don't pay attention to it, a barrel is 31 gallons of beer. So if you divide these out by that'll give you pounds per gallon. But it's a really nice recommendation depending on when you're adding. So we're going to talk about that here in just a second too, which is, are you adding during fermentation? Are you adding post fermentation? Do you want the beer to stand out more, or do you want the fruit to stand out more? That goes back to the core of this talk, which is back to where are you finding the balance? If you're, when I have a beer, I want to definitely taste your beer. I like having the fruit in there. But I want it in balance. If you call out a style and say, hey, I made a IPA with mango, I want to make sure that I can taste an IPA in there as well.
Yeah. You usually need to look for the fruit a little bit. Like, you don't want it to come up slap you across the face.
Yeah, if you get all the fruit and satisfaction in 1 ounce of your beverage, are you going to drink a full? That's a really nice rule of thumb with balance of a beverage. Did you get it all in 1 sip, or by the time you're down to ounce
you want to be continually chasing that next sip.
Yeah,
and ordering the second pint.
The second pint, of course, is
the second pint is that's the seal of approval.
That's the holy grail right there, right? But this, again, back to this chart, it's an outstanding reference point. Notice you can even see on here, like, as you probably common sense will tell you too, citrus, very low dosing compared to, say, orchard fruits like apples and things like that, which are going to have a much softer contribution.
Yeah, something like peaches are very hard to get to come through, like notoriously hard to get to come. I usually add twice as much peach puree to anything I'm doing from what I would for other fruits, because otherwise it's just not going to pop.
Oh, it makes good sense. I like that. So let's talk about prepping up. Let's say you're using that fresh fruit. Let's prep up some fruit. Do you skin it or you don't skin it? Well, what does the skin contribute? If you're doing like, I remember about 8 years ago, cucumber goses were getting popular there for a while. I actually had a couple really good ones. I had a lot of vegetal ones too. Those, you need to peel the skin off your cucumbers. They're going to bring, that kind of skin will bring in a vegetal note. Thick skin, some of them that are obvious, like watermelon, don't put the rind in there. Mangoes and papayas, remove the skin. Those skins are going to have a lot of bitter contributions and things like that to the ferment. They're not going to make your ferment good. Citrus for a minute. You want to talk about citrus?
Yeah. So I try to avoid adding as much pith as possible. So you don't just want to cut oranges or grapefruits or whatever in half and throw them in there. It's usually what I'll do is I'll skin it and kind of break it up and add it in there. But the zest can add kind of an additional level of citrus notes in there. So for certain one, especially if I'm working with limes or something like that, I'll get my microplaner and kind of zest a little bit and add that. Either add it later on in fermentation, or I'll make a tincture with it with some vodka.
Nice. Yeah, that's a really nice way to pull it too. We'll talk about extracts in a minute, which are alcohol tinctures. Basically, we'll hit those. It's a little side note I have to talk about a few things. Seed or not to seed. This is a long conversation, which we don't want to get too much into. But the seeds and pits and stones, especially of certain fruits, can contain what are called cyanide precursors. It doesn't mean it's full cyanide, but they have precursors. We actually ingest a decent amount of this stuff through, eating fruit and such. There are some certain notes that come in. It's a trivial amount. The less you take in, the better, obviously. There are enzymes in fermentation and in our own metabolic systems in our bodies that can convert things over into cyanide. So be wary of it. Probably an easy to read article. If you go on the American Homebrewers Association website, look at back issues of Zymergy, and there's an article by Joe Formanek from that winter, November, December 2000 issue. He has a great breakdown of that. Denny Kahn has some contribution to that article as well. Highly recommend you read it as you think about it. Some of those classic styles like Kriek, the cherry Belgian beer, it does have that little nutty almondy note that comes from benzaldehyde and other precursors that float around by leaving the pits in the cherries for a couple months in the ferment. So judicious use of that. I mentioned, it's actually at the bottom here. I mentioned that substitute a shot of amaretto. Kevin put up his favorite pitting tool. So
yeah, it's kind of hungry hippo style. Runs about $30 to $40 on Amazon, but it's going to make the process a lot easier. It's kind of automated feed. Just easy to use. It's worth the $30 if you're making using a lot of cherries, especially fresh ones.
Ooh, yeah, and which fresh cherries are unbeatable. Those dark Montmorencys and dark tarts are just wonderful in ferment. And large stones like mangoes, peaches, plums, apricots, pop those out of there. Don't use those stones. Breaking it down, if you want to, the easiest thing is to puree things. Remember the Vitamix that you bought? I know you went on that health kick that 1 week. And you bought the Vitamix.
I still got my Ninja from Costco on the counter that I get to use it about every other month at this point, but it's mostly for brewing projects.
There you go, nice. But it's a great, easy tool. Don't forget to sanitize it. Chop things down. Using a potato masher or a whisk, a great way to crush down softer fruits. Things like, remember, we want to break cell walls down. We want to break it open so that the fermentation process, the yeast can access all the sugars and such, and we get all the way through it. I mentioned earlier the freeze thaw method. Put everything in a Ziploc bag. The easiest way to, but berries. If you're doing blackberries or raspberries. When I was brewing with an old college roommate 26 years ago, we would go out to the river area and go pick. We get a few friends, pour beer into them, get them drunk, and get them all go out and pick raspberries with us or blackberries, and then we'd go back and do blackberry wheat beers. Those are really fun. But freeze them, thaw them, freeze them again. When you thaw them again, they're going to be pretty mushy. Sanitize the outside of your bag. Sanitize your scissors. Just cut the corner off like a pastry bag and just down into the ferment. You can't. Not an easier way to do it. It's just really, really great. At this point, we're going to stop talking about pectin for a minute because we brought it up earlier. We talked about it in terms of pasteurization. It's a big starch molecule. What it does in actual fruit is it gives structure to the cell wall of the fruit. So what happens though is if you put pectin in the presence of sugars and acids and you heat it up, you made jelly. You're not making beer anymore. So you've got to watch a different lecture if you want to learn how to make jelly. What will happen sometimes is if we leave that floating around in there, we're going to end up with a pectic haze sometimes. So sometimes you leave those because again, it's a big saccharide. It'll stay floating around a solution, doesn't necessarily fall out. So using pectinase or a pectic enzyme. What do you recommend on that?
I mean, it comes in both powdered and liquid form. We have the little half-ounce droppers that I usually just keep. I keep a couple of those on hand in my fridge that I'll usually use for my ciders or anything I'm doing fruit with. And you can add it. I mean, you can add it at multiple different times or different points in the process. You can add it while you're crushing. If you're doing ciders or a perry and you're crushing, if you add it to the pomace, it'll help break down those cell walls and you'll get better juice extraction out of it. You can use it in grapes with winemaking when you're doing that, or you can add it directly to the fermenter during the fermentation process. It'll help break down those pectins at that point. Or if you get later on in the fermentation process and you realize that you have a pectin haze issue, you can add it then and it'll help break it down.
That's a really good tip, really good call out. So,
and then it's the fruits that tend to be higher in pectins too, are the ones that tend to be firmer. So things like apples, pears, quince.
A really good call out. So yeah, pectinase is your friend with those fruits. It's not hard to use, and like Kevin said, there's some fallbacks. You can use it later on in the process and still get rid of those things without being stuck with a hazy beverage. I guess hazy IPA. Just call it an IPA and that's pops to it. It just works out. Using a strainer bag really helps out in terms of managing all the mess in your fermenter or your bucket. I'll when I'm doing fruit beers, I always bucket ferment because obviously you're never going to clean out a carboy, things like that. Use something that's wide. Those inexpensive single-use muslin cotton bags, dirt cheap, really
cleanup is easy. You throw it in the compost bin when you're done.
Yeah, because that'll break down too, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's really cool. I didn't even think about that. I have some nylon bags. They're robust. They tend to last a long time. Just make sure that you sanitize the bag before you put the fruit in there and drop it in your
which
fermenter.
Product would you use for doing that?
Of course, starts there, right? The other nice thing when you use those bags, you can hang that bag. Put it, hang it on something in the fermenter. So that you can extract it, you pull it out and just chuck it aside without oxidizing your beverage, without leave it under that CO2 blanket. I'm always talking about oxidation. Oxidation wrecks your beer, wrecks your any of your beverages, and it also will inactivate, like we talked about those stone fruit thiols. In the presence of oxygen, they rebind to things and they lose their flavor and their aromas. They shut right off. So managing oxygen and oxidation is again one of those top 5 handling techniques for beer.
Yeah, if you have a draft system, I'll usually purge my keg before transferring into it. I'll use it to leave a layer of CO2 on top of things, use CO2 to push things rather than gravity. Just use an inert gas like CO2 as much as possible, just to avoid your your beer, wine, cider, whatever into coming in contact
Absolutely.
with air.
Yeah, super important. Filtration, it's not a choice for beer. Like by using these types of things, I mean, there is, obviously in commercial applications we'll filter a bit, but we filtering, you run the risk of stripping flavors and things like that out. Clearly with wine and mead and things like that, cider, I have a little Bonvino mini jet. It's easy to handle, and there's 3 sizes of filters. I tend to sometimes just use the most coarse one.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really have to filter too much, but if you just want to knock down, any fruit particles or anything left over from your ferment, that's a good idea. And then let's shift over and talk for a minute about finings, if you want to use them. Most of the time, first and foremost, in any fermentation, your best friend is time. Take your time. Fermentation is not about hurrying up and getting through with it. Leaving something aside, letting it set, oftentimes that time, as well as maybe a racking, moving it from one vessel to another very carefully after cold crashing and leaving as much material as you can. Over time, your beverage will clarify on its own.
I think the biggest personal growth thing that I've gained in 15 years of homebrewing is just learning patience. And just that it's okay to stick something in a corner and just let it set.
Absolutely. From a beverage perspective, we actually both entered a couple things in the Washington Mead and Cider Cup, won several awards. All of those ferments were done last year. I won. I took a first with a Gravenstein apple cider. I made that cider back in September. It spent a little bit of time on French oak, like 3 weeks on some French oak cubes, but that was bottled in March, April. So that beverage had time on it. Mead, as winemaker, you understand, we don't make wine and we're not sucking wine down in a few weeks. We're giving it time. We all know that the beverage builds over time. Fruited beers and things like that. Obviously, an IPA, we want to drink IPAs pretty fresh because we want that pop of fresh hops and things like that. Once they start losing that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. But a lot of times if there's something in, like your beverage that, you're tasting that you don't like, stick it aside for a month and, it'll a lot of times that'll disappear. It'll end up becoming more complex and you'll find some other flavors have developed as well.
Absolutely. Wine tasting term, structure. What does structure mean? Structure means polymerized tannins from sitting around in bottles for years. Things do things over time very slow. That's why aging wine, certain wines, high tannic wines, has a benefit to it. It creates structure. There's more complexity to it. You can apply the same thing to your mead making, to your cider making, etc. So, many of these beverages do very well when they hang out for a little bit. Let's run through a couple real quick. Let's run through a couple of the fining agents that you use if you want to do that. You want to run through these, Kevin?
Yeah, sure. Gelatin, I mean, you can find it at most homebrew shops. This is the one that I tend to use more than any other, just because it's cheap, readily available, and it works very well, especially in conjunction with a cold crash. If you're able to do that with the setup that you have, most homebrew shops will have it. I usually just buy the unflavored Knox from the Safeway. You get the 4 little sachets for, I think it's like $1.50 or $2. And I keep a bunch of that on hand. But it's not vegan, so if you have vegan or vegetarian friends, they can be a little iffy on that one. Even that'll settle out. Isinglass, which you'll find at most of the homebrew shops. Traditionally it's been used in a lot of beers and wines. I think it was Guinness that was using it commercially for a while. There was that whole thing a while ago about there's fish in Guinness. Well, this is what it was. There's plenty of other things in Guinness too. It's fish swim bladders, usually sturgeon, I believe, and it's available in liquid or dry form. Kieselsäure and chitosan, which you'll usually find as a 2-part clarifier. It's included with a lot of the commercial wine extract kits that you'll buy, the Wine Expert and the RJ Spagnol's. They also sell it with it's a 2-part clarifier that gets sold with a lot of distilling products. So it's a 2-part clarifier. One of them is silica based. The other one is chitosan, which usually comes from shellfish, but there's a couple of vegan products on the market as well, which come from, they're fungal based. And then bentonite and sparkleoid, which are earth based. But those are typically used for wines. And those, the bentonite, the sparkleoid, in my experience, it feels like they strip a lot of the flavor out when you use them.
Yeah, they're judicious use again. In commercial winemaking, a commercial winemaker would do what are called fining trials. They're going to take samples of it, put in a bunch of things, and add different doses. Look for the right amount for that beverage that they made that day, or that season, I should say. So judicious use, less is more. If you're not sure, go with the lower dose, and don't make sure that you're focusing on the flavor and aroma of your beverage. It's going to be a lot better. If you got a little haze in something, as long as it tastes really good,
Yeah, I mean, fining isn't always necessary,
Right.
and a lot of times just a cold crash by itself, if you're able to do that, or if you're able to stick your fermenter in a kegerator for a couple days, like a lot of times that's just going to be enough.
Yep, exactly. A couple fermentation considerations as we get into this. Sugar is going to increase the gravity of your fermentation, right? Because that's what we're getting out of if we're making beer, it's what we're getting out of our grains. If it's mead or cider, we're getting it out of our honey or our apples, respectively. So there's a great source. If you Google USDA Food Data Central, this is a great place to figure out, well, how much sugar am I getting? So what you end up with is this is what blueberries look like on the Food Data Central website. If you look up blueberries, it actually has a ton of other information about it, but it's going to tell you which fruits in what quantities, which sugars in what quantities appear in the fruits. So if you notice this is blueberries, in 100 grams of blueberries, you're going to find it's going to be kind of a nice, mostly fructose and glucose. They don't really produce sucrose. Obviously, the other ones aren't going to be there. But you can go through here and find these things. Don't try to write the website down. Just Google that, just USD Food Data Central. And notice the range that fruits can contribute. This is just a quick look at some fruits here. These are in either cups or by each. Things like a lime has almost no sugar added in here. On the opposite side of the scale are like figs and figs. Figs are really high in sugar. Dry, and I left this on here to point out, if you notice, if you use dried things, like here's dried goji berries. Remember, when you dry it, you concentrate it, so be careful of the number of things you put in there. Dried fruits have a lot of sugar per unit volume because they took all the water out of it. So think about that. Raisins pack a huge amount of sugar in them. I do like to play around with raisins in Belgian quads, things like that. I like making, when I want to make a really big beer, I'll play with things like raisins and dates and stuff like that. They have a lot of fun flavors. Just careful, you're gonna raise up the alcohol. But if you're making a Belgian quad, I don't think you're going to care about that. Yeah. Is there too much? Yeah. We've talked plenty about acidity. Most fruits are going to drive it down. Please get a good pH meter. If you're not brewing with a pH meter, you can really greatly improve. It's another great affordable thing to add to your brewing toolkit that helps out. Mine's probably a $65 one. I don't like the little $14 yellow ones. They last about a week of use and then they're kind of done. Excuse me. If you're starting off in your mash, you can make pH adjustments in your mash for optimal mashing. If you're cider making or wine making, you can, in fact, we'll talk in a moment about stabilization. If you're sulfiting, you have to know your pH. You can't use sulfites and not know the pH of your beverage because they have a correlation. But measuring your pH, knowing that your pH of your beverage isn't going to get below what the yeast that you're putting in can tolerate. So whatever yeast you're using, make sure you look up the specs on it. Make sure that it's going to survive in the fermentation conditions. You get ferments that get below 3, and a lot of yeast just are done. They're kind of done. Sometimes you have to switch to a different yeast, one that's going to be a little more happy in an acidic environment. So to mention enough of that. Tannin contributions. We talked about that balance and knowing that the fruit's going to bring some tannins in there, or if you want to bring some tannins in a beverage, oak chips, oak staves, oak cubes. There's a million of those. Also, one of the things we do, like nice, it's not a shortcut, it's just a really nice way to control your tan additions. Make a tincture of a black tea. Take some black tea bags, make a concentrate. That you do have to do some trials with. Make sure you're using, maybe a small little graduated cylinder. Figure out the proportion that tastes right to you, and then go lower than you want, because after you've tasted it 5 times, you got some tannin insensitivity.
You can always add it in, but it's pretty hard to take it back out.
Hard to take that out. Yeah, exactly. The other things you're going to get from that fruit, obviously, is color. So think about how you want your beverage to look. And we talked earlier about the mouthfeel side, non-fermentable sugars being left, increasing the body of your beverage. Does that work for your beverage? Conversely, you can build mouthfeel with using fruits that leave behind some of those non-fermentables as well. That helps as much. A major consideration for a lot of ferments besides a beer ferment is the available nitrogen. There's a bunch of information up here, and you notice that there's a couple of these techie terms, but they're really important, especially if you're a winemaker, a mead maker, or a cider maker, and that's the availability of nitrogen. So you'll see these terms thrown around, like the YAN term, yeast assimilable nitrogen, FAN, free amino nitrogen. They get confusing. What it really means is the number you want to look at is the yeast assimilable nitrogen, because that's a combination of all the free amino nitrogen. It happens to be nitrogen left from proteins, ammonia and ammonium ion available, blah blah. Don't worry about all that stuff. Get down to the number of it, which is knowing that most ferments, you need about 200 parts per million of yeast available nitrogen. If you have more sugar and you have a hotter ferment, or a more high gravity ferment, you're going to need to have a little more nitrogen to support that yeast. It is but after sugar, it's the most important yeast nutrient. Cider and mead both tend to be low in nitrogen, quite low, in fact. Grapes, depends on the variety, depends on how you're fermenting it. It's for you to do some research on that before you get into it, but learn a little bit about that. The flip side, when you add nitrogen, like if you use diammonium phosphate, DAP, and other nitrogen sources, it's like putting green fertilizer on your lawn. A lot of things can grow with it. The weeds will grow, right? Well, you can get wild and spoilage organisms can flourish in there. So think that through. But it's a really common cause of stuck fermentations of those other beverages. Beer, by the way, with barley involved, barley's got a lot of nitrogen in it. Malt contributes. Beer tends not to need any nitrogen in the ferment, tends to do pretty well. If you're doing a huge amount of fruit and not a lot of barley, like a really, really fruit forward, you may need to consider that. You can use that USDA Food Data Central. It's got some nitrogen numbers there as well. And you may have to do a little bit of trial and error.
Yeah, well, and side note from that too, I mean, especially with higher gravity meads, this Ken Schramm has a standard nutrient addition that it's available in plenty of places online, but for the higher gravity meads, that I definitely tend to follow, where rather than just front loading a bunch of nitrogen and nutrients up front, you're kind of staggering it out.
Staggered nutrient additions is really important, and that's again digging deeply into what's going on with meads and ciders and things like that. For timing, we're going to move through a couple things here, just because we want to make sure I get to the end of this here before we wrap up here in about 6-7 minutes. The timing of your addition, this is really important. Are you co-fermenting the fruit, or are you doing a secondary addition? If you co-ferment your fruit, you're adding the fruit at the time of your initial inoculation of yeast when you're fermenting it together. What are you going to get out of that? You're going to get those vinous flavors, more wine-like flavors out of it when they co-ferment.
Yeah, a lot of the flavors and aroma are getting blown out during fermentation as well. A lot of those more delicate flavors.
So that vigor, and so that's another thing about temperature control. Run your ferments a little cooler so you don't blow, because that vigorous ferment is going to drive, again, volatiles fly off with CO2 production. You got a lot of CO2 bubbling through, it's going to pick things up and strip it away. Same with hops, things like that. If you're adding, you finish your primary ferment, then you add afterwards, just as it finishes primary fermentation, either rack and add or just add the fruit in the secondary fermentation. you're going to expect a little bit more fruit flavor. I got to make a really important call out here because we run into this in beverage making and judging constantly. Don't expect fresh fruit flavors from a fermentation. Okay, cider is not supposed to taste like fresh apples any more than beer is supposed to taste like wort or fresh malt. I'm going to make a big point of this because I've actually struggled some of the challenging with judging at ciders. People are like, well, I really expected more fresh apple flavor out of the cider. Well, that's like saying I've expected more raw barley flavor out of my beer. It would be, well, this is a fermented beverage. So remember that it's going to transform, fermentation transforms the flavors of your fruits. Wine doesn't taste like fresh grapes. Fermented fruit should not taste like fresh fruit. It's going to taste like fermentation. So make sure you think about that. I'll see notes where people said, oh, the beverage was musty. Well, cellar notes are common. It's one thing to have like a mushroomy thing going on, but cellar notes are actually an attribute. It's sometimes just people are expecting for ciders a fizzy alcoholic Martinelli cider or something like that. That's not what a fermented fruit should taste like. I don't want to go into the differences right now between extracts versus natural versus artificial flavors, although I know a lot of people like to use them. I do too. Just for a moment, pointing out natural flavors are anything that are, so an extract actually comes from that thing. It's found only in that fruit. You can find emulsions, which are water extracts. Other ones are alcohol extracts, right? Natural flavors they're flavors, extracts, and compounds found anywhere in plants and foods that make the flavor profile. And then artificial ones are obviously laboratory produced. Even if they have the exact same chemical composition, they have to call it that. So it doesn't mean a quote artificial flavor is necessarily a less of a flavor. We can tear apart just for a second here, like where vanilla comes from. Vanilla is the most popular flavor worldwide. We can either extract it from vanilla beans. There's Castoria. It's not the most popular method. It's out there, but be aware of it. It comes from the rear end glands of beavers, and it is extracted into this thing that actually has a very vanilla. It's considered generally recognized as safe. Not a lot of it's produced, but it is gaining in popularity as we find ways to replace vanilla. Bulk vanilla substitute is made from wood pulp extracts, from the lignin and guaiacol from wood. And it actually has a higher purity of vanillin than real vanilla actually does. But you should know that. Let's actually fly through the last couple things because it's important for you to think about preserving and stabilizing if you are working with something besides beer. So meads, ciders, wine. So sulfiting is kind of a lecture unto itself. You can sanitize your fruit beforehand before you put in the ferment with a sulfite mixture. Sulfite is a fermentation inhibitor. It doesn't necessarily kill things. It is going to just inhibit things. It's also a really great antioxidant. It's how red wines stay red. That's if you take a little red wine in a glass, tilt it over to where there's just a thin little bit on the edge of the glass. You can see if there's a little brown edge. It's oxidizing wine. So you do that with mead as well, with darker, like especially ones that are done with a darker or a melomel with dark fruit. It's pH dependent. There's a few forms. Sodium metabisulfite tends to be a good thing to clean equipment with because it contributes salt. That's not necessarily something you want to ferment. The common one is potassium metabisulfite. Camden tablets are really nice, easy to use because they're pre-measured. You throw a few in. If you're a brewer and you're trying to get rid of sulfur out of your water, things like that, that works pretty well. Chlorine out of your water.
Chlorine.
Yeah. Potassium sorbate, another one we talked about it earlier. That we see it commercially, but you can also use it yourself. Use it in. You pair it with sulfites. You can't use it if you're going to do a malolactic thing with a wine, something like that. I won't go into that. This is more for you to look at. And then the last one is sodium or potassium benzoate. Again, the one that we mostly see commercially. How do you avoid modern bomb making? This is a big problem these days with these fresh fruit things.
Yeah, these smoothie IPAs and pastry stouts and stuff like that.
So what can you do with that to inhibit that re-fermentation?
Sulfites and sorbates. are definitely the easy
Excellent,
one.
yeah.
Yeah, it's those I tend to do that. I keg mostly. I don't really bottle that much, but if I'm carbonating in a keg, that's usually how I'll end up doing it. Yeah, just prevents bottles things from re-fermenting in the bottle and exploding. Or just consuming things as fresh as possible, keeping them refrigerated, which is why for a lot of those commercial super fruity beers where they're adding usually purees like post fermentation and then canning, and that's why they tell you to keep it refrigerated and cold, just so that it doesn't reactivate that fermentation. But that's also why you see a lot of people talking about, I bought a can from this brewery and it blew up in my car.
Yeah. Maybe avoid the style.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Or make it at home.
Yeah, or make it exactly. Yeah, one fun thing to do there. So, we're actually at the end of our time, but a couple things to call out because this relates back to somebody's question back here about pineapple. Pineapple contains a chemical called bromelain. Guava and papaya have it too. It's why if you're a barbecue guy like me, you sometimes use these in meat to tenderize them. It's called a protease. It breaks proteins down. That means it's going to break down the proteins that can contribute to the head stability of your beer, so it can kill your foam on your beer. So there's a challenge there. If you're using agave syrup, I'm a fan of agave and like IPAs and stuff like that. It adds a little nice back note. Too much of it. The problem is agave itself contains a natural chemical called furfural, which is toxic to many yeast strains. I mentioned that thing about strawberries. That's my last thing I'm going to talk about, is that a lot of the flavor of strawberry are esters in this family of things called butyrates. Butyric acid is the baby vomit note that people get out of things. There's also another group of these in strawberries, these lighter molecules, ethanoate. So in a fermentation, those ethanoate things can flash off and just leave the butyric stuff behind. So a lot of people think their beer got contaminated. Not necessarily. You flashed off the other part that together made strawberry. When they separate, you get that. Interestingly, that butyric acid component in time with alcohol will form these other things called butyrates without doing the chemistry. But time and alcohol, again, if you got a little bark, let it sit. It will, those butyrate things, those butyric acids will turn into more tropical fruity notes. So interesting challenge of playing with these things. So at that point, we want to say thank you to 5-Star, to Aaron and Emily for having us on and part of this. And I hope you guys learned a little bit. And thank you.
Thanks, guys. And I will have, I don't know why it's echoing, but Mike answer some of those questions that everybody asked in the bottom. Mike, if you can I'll send them to you. If you can write them out, and then I'll make sure everyone gets them in the follow-up email. Once again, this is being recorded, so I'll send out the recording and a couple other links provided by Mike and Kevin. And with that, I would like to remind everyone that next month we do have a presentation on brewery financing, and that is June 30th. So thanks again for joining us, guys, and I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks, man.
We'll see you next time.